session 21. Now, although this is session 21, I've handed out an additional, I don't know on yours how many it is, but it's a number of pages of notes that are going to, they're an addition to 19 and 20 that we handed out last time. And the reason I'm going to go through that on the PowerPoint so that you'll be able to see it. But we covered things in the lesson last Sunday that, well, let me just talk to you about it. When I'm looking at things in there and we're doing it differently than everybody else is doing it, I just really look at it a lot. And we did. Last week, we actually looked at some scriptures and I explained some differences to you. But as I was looking at that, you know, that stuff kind of stays with me. And so as I was looking at that, I just kept looking at it. And then as we got down into the material for today, a light kind of came on and I thought, you know what? Not only was I right, but there's more depth to this than I thought there was. So I have to take us back to look at these two issues. And the reason I have to do it is because there are, look, when you're just reading along in your Bible, if you were doing it from the standpoint of a biblical theology, you know what that is, starting at Genesis 1 and working your way through and not jumping ahead, there are things, if you did it that way, that are in the Scripture that when you came to them, it would be like a lightning bolt. Suddenly you're told something. I mean, can you imagine not knowing anything ahead of time and then discovering the aspect of the mystery that we call the rapture? I mean, you would look at that and say, wow, look at that. But that's such old hat to us. We read the Scriptures about it doesn't do that to us. Well, as we've come through the sonship material, we've seen some things that have been wow-type things, but we almost have to see what's in it for sonship in order for that wow impact to take place. Otherwise, you're just reading that verse from an old understanding standpoint and it doesn't wow you at all. Well, we read a verse last time that had a wow aspect to it that we didn't see. I didn't bring it out. Now, I was going to, but I wasn't going to bring it out to the depth that I should have. Remember, I told you that when we come back next time, I'm going to talk to you about how we're supposed to view the time. Remember, the time is going to be, and we talked about, you know, redeeming the time and all that. You know, we just talked about the way time is handled. But as I was looking at that in this week's lesson, it occurred to me that what that was connected to back in last week's lesson made something back there an even bigger issue than I thought it was. So, here's what I want to do. I want to begin to take us through this. So let me do it. And I hate these addendums because you've already heard part of this, but so I'm kind of picking up from there. Oh well, you'll see. Romans 11:22. Here's the verse where we did something different from everybody else that's teaching sonship. Behold, therefore, the goodness and severity of God on them which fell, that would be Israel, right? On them which fell, severity. Why is he talking about severity? Because that was the breaking off of their program, right? They no longer enjoy the favored nation status. Remember, now they have a standing of being accursed from Christ. That's the severity issue. He says, on them which fell, severity, but toward thee, and who's the thee? Gentiles, but toward thee, goodness. And that is true, right? Remember, we talked about, you know what, I drew that little tree when remember, we did this thing, we did the branches in the tree like this, and I brought it down. We had the roots come down. Remember when I drew that? Well, when I taught that the last Tuesday that we were at Glen Rose, everybody, they do like y'all. They're taking notes. They're looking at their notes. They're taking notes. Bob Summers is back. Bob Summers takes copious notes. But when I drew that tree up there, I made fun of him. Those of you that don't know, Bob Summers is an artist. He's internationally known. He's just very talented. So I drew this tree with all these branches, and I told everybody, I said, I'm sorry my tree's not any better, but Bob Summers taught me how to draw. And so I just threw him under the bus, right? So when he comes up at the break, I should have brought it. I should have scanned it and put it on the PowerPoint. I'll bring it up and you can look at it. He came up with his notes, and at the bottom of his notes, he drew the two trees. The olive tree and the wild olive tree. Remember, it was a little scraggly something. He drew this olive tree, and he must have sketched it out in about a minute and a half, maybe. I said, what, did it take you 2 minutes to draw that? He said, not quite. So maybe a minute and a half. You would not believe this tree. It looks like something in a painting. It's unbelievable. And so I told him, and I said, you know what I'm going to do is I'm going to put that in my notes at Monahans and tell them I did that. Anyway, now I'm coming clean. Anyway, little side story there. So this tree, this is the Bob Summers tree right here, so now everybody knows. This tree we talked about was the tree, and we just used that phrase right out of the verse, the tree of God's goodness. Now, how is that different from how this gets done? Because everybody wants to make the tree Israel. Because they're the natural branches, then they think the tree is Israel. But remember, there's a problem with that, because if the tree is Israel, then when we're grafted in, guess what we're grafted into? Israel. And Paul's going to go to great lengths to convince you we are not Israel in any shape or form. So the tree, and then we discovered the answer. Why was Israel the natural branches? Why were they called that? Okay, because they got nothing but God's goodness from the very beginning of their program, right? Remember, God made a covenant with Abraham and promised to make of him a great nation. From him, Isaac, Jacob, from Jacob, the 12 sons. They have always had this place of special attention with God. What did He promise? I'll make them the head of all nations. I'll multiply them. I'll bless them. I'll give them a land. I'll bring them in. He's going to set up a kingdom with them, right? And through them, the word of the Lord would go forth to all the other nations of the world. So they're the natural branches, not because the root and the tree is Israel. The root and the tree is God's goodness, or you could call it, we called it a bunch of different things. I knew it was going to roll right down in behind there. I knew it was going to do it. Okay, it is the tree. Okay, this is not an omen of how this session's going to go. I refuse to believe that. Here we go. This is the tree of God's working. Remember, this is the cultivated tree. That little scraggly olive tree over here, that the Gentiles, that wild olive tree, remember, that was just out on its own. This is the one that's being cultivated, cared for, pruned, dug about, fertilized, watered, everything that needs to be done to make it happen. This is the tree of God's working. It's who He's paying attention to. And if Israel, who were the natural branches in there, if they get broken off and He puts us in there, that doesn't make this tree a Gentile tree. It still is the tree of God's goodness to Gentiles, yes? Now to me that makes perfect sense without violating anything else that Paul is saying. So here's the next part we need to look at here. On them which fell severity, but toward thee goodness. And then here's this part. If thou continue in His goodness, otherwise thou also shalt be cut off. There are only two ways. In fact, I've got this on the PowerPoint, I think, and I don't need to. So there's only two ways to look at what that means. If thou continue in His goodness. So Here's one. We will continue to experience the goodness of God for as long as He gives it, and when He stops giving us Gentiles His goodness, then His program with the Gentiles will be cut off. And that's what everybody else is teaching. And listen, I'm not saying they have to teach it the way I do. I'm telling you, though, the way this is being taught. And by the way, that's not an untrue statement. When God gets through working with us Gentiles, He won't be working with us anymore. That is true. But I think that goes without saying. I mean, who didn't know that? It's kind of like asking on your way out the door, hey, do I need to put gas? I'm fixing to go to do I need to put gas in the car? What if this is the answer you get? You'll continue to have gas in the car for as long as there's gas in the car. Does that tell you anything? No. Because the idea is that this idea that we just talked about here, will continue to experience the goodness of God for as long as He gives it. And when He stops giving us Gentiles His goodness, then His program with the Gentiles will be cut off. And what they're saying is, God is arbitrarily going to just cut this program off one day, not based on anything outside of Himself, just because that's what He decided. Now, I don't see that. I don't ever see God working that way. I don't ever see God working arbitrarily. I see Him always working in connection with a plan and a purpose. Now, that's not enough to convince anybody. I'm just giving you both sides of the coin. Here's the other one. Our continuing to experience the good... Now, this is the second way to look at it. Our continuing to experience the goodness of God in this dispensation of grace is contingent upon something external to God Himself. Let me ask you a question. When God broke off His program with Israel, was it because of something with Israel, or did He just decide to do it? What did He observe that made Him break that program off? Their unbelief. In other words, and by the way, didn't the verse actually say that to us? Well, because of unbelief, they were broken off. I'm quoting the verse there. So because of their unbelief, they were broken off. And then He grafts us in. And if we're in there, would you think that in a dispensation of grace that God would just look at us and say, well, here, and by the way, this is, and it's fine if you want to do that. And if you want to believe this, this is fine. And I'm going to tell it to you. I'm just saying I don't think this is right. I don't think it's a correct statement. I just don't think it's everything that's contained in the verse. But to say that God is just one day going to break this off just all on His own, not because of anything else that's going on, here's what you have to be able to teach about that. Every moment of every day, you are that far away from this being over and the day of wrath coming on the scene. Now, if I'm wrong and that's the way this is, well, then you don't have a promise of even tonight.
Everything that God has done, that we learned about, talked about, everything, like the Tower of Babel. Why did he wanted to? No, there's things going on.
Right.
Every time of everything, take it back in Jesus' day, when they were talking about the man trying to get to the water.
Right.
Because and he couldn't get there because everybody else could get him. And like you said, there was reasons that God did everything. Nothing was just spur of the moment or, oh, just because I wanted to. There was something behind each thing that he had done. To me,
it fits, doesn't it? In other words, and I know people on the DVD are wondering what was all that because we missed it. What you're saying in a nutshell is God has not just acted capriciously ever. There is a track record that everything He has done has had wisdom behind it, and it was always in accordance with something else that was happening. That sum it up? Okay. Right, it's not random. And see, and that's not how I see it either. Now, by the way, if you... let me just... I'm tempted to get off my notes, and if I do that, I'll get in trouble. So so here's what I'm going to tell you. That's something external to God. I didn't identify what it is here, but I'm going to back up to the verse because I'm going to show you what it is. It says, I'm sorry, let me back up one more. But toward thee goodness, if, and I say that's a conditional word, if. In other words, when you say to when your kids say, can I go out and play? If you've cleaned your room, you placed a condition on it. We'll continue in that goodness if thou, and that's the next important thing. So if gives you a condition. Thou puts the condition on us. Not if God continues His goodness, but if thou do something. And so now the condition is on us. What is it we're going to do? If thou continue in His goodness. Now we have to understand, what does it mean for us to continue in that goodness? Now, and that's one of the things that we're going to be talking about here. Now, in order to get this, I've got to take you back now to this next set of verses that we looked at. Verse 19. Thou wilt say then, the branches were broken off that I might be grafted in. Well, because of unbelief they were broken off, and thou standest by faith. I'll talk to you about that phrase in just a moment. But I want you to see that what God did with Israel was not arbitrary. He did it in response to something they were failing to do. You say, well, they didn't believe. They didn't. And because they didn't believe, do you know what was happening? What God was trying to accomplish in His program with Israel, they were not cooperating with, were they? And so because of that, He interrupted that program. We know the breaking off was temporary, but now let's keep reading. He says, and thou standest by faith. Be not high-minded, but fear. For if God spared not the natural branches, take heed, lest He also spare not thee. Now, when we get, let's see, and I'm in 19 and 21. So I'm saying this, that God didn't just break Israel off for no reason. He broke them off because of unbelief. Does everybody see that? All right. In other words, He's responding to something when He does that. And by the way, and I didn't say this last week, but breaking Israel's program off was a mercy. When I was writing this, I wrote this. I took it out, but here's what I typed. Israel deserved to be broken off because of their unbelief. But as soon as I wrote that, I thought, no, wait a minute. They didn't deserve to be broken off. They deserved the day of wrath. That's what they deserved. By breaking their program off, just think about what happened. Here's a bunch of Jews that had rejected Christ, right? They had rejected Him. But instead of plunging them into the day of wrath, the tribulation, what does He do? He brings in a dispensation of grace to just Gentiles, to the whole world. And those same Jews that rejected Jesus being the Messiah are going to get another chance under grace to be saved. That's why I'm saying it's a mercy. And by the way, I'm not using that word arbitrarily. It's about to show up 4 times in 3 verses, that word mercy. And we're going to get over there and we're going to look at that. But what God is doing is He is extending a time of goodness to everybody. Now He says to us, remember in 22, which is the branch that follows this, the verse that follows this, He says, that behold, therefore, the goodness and severity of God. On them which fell, severity. On thee, goodness. If thou continue, and that's what we were looking at, if, condition, thou, that's us Gentiles, continue in that goodness, otherwise thou also shall be cut off. I'm looking at this as though there's something we are supposed to do. And so this will take you back now. Verse 20. Well, because of unbelief they were broken off, and thou standest by faith. Be not high-minded, but fear. And then that last part, take heed, lest he also spare not thee. I need to talk to you about the fear and the take heed. Because really, when you talk about fear, be not high-minded, but fear, really, that's something you have to get right. Because the one thing we've learned is that the relationship with Israel under the law was one of fear. But do you know what? That's not the way it is for us, is it? As sons, we don't look at God in fear. So it's not talking about with the relationship. So what is the fear about? And what is the take heed? What I didn't do for you last week, I kept looking at that verse and I thought, take heed, take heed. So I looked up heed. I went back to that Crabb's synonyms and I looked at the word heed, and this was very interesting. To heed means to attend, and it applies to matters of importance in one's moral character. Now, what the verse didn't say is take care. And then Crabb says care is solicitude to matters of minor import. Well, I looked at solicitude and I thought, what is that? And I put it in parentheses for you. It means to attention or concern to matters of minor import. Let me use them in a sentence for you. If you would say, take heed that the people you're running with don't corrupt you. But if you're on a icy sidewalk, you'd say, take care that you don't slip down. Care has something immediate. It's what's happening to you right there. Take heed has something in the future in mind. And I'm going to show you the rest of Crabb's definition because this is great. A man is required, this is what he wrote. I thought this is great. A man is required to take heed. A child is required to take care. And we're being treated as adults, are we not? Then, heed exercises his understanding and taking heed. Care exercises his thoughts and senses and taking care. That's fine, but here's what we're really after right here. Heed looks to the remote and probable consequences of his actions and endeavors to prevent the evil that may happen, while care sees principally to the thing that is immediately before him. Do you see? I don't know if this is affecting you like it did me, but when I saw that, if heed is looking at probable consequences of our actions, and by taking heed we can avoid the consequences of that, then let's go back. Well, I don't have it on the board. I have to go back to the verse. Take heed lest, what's the consequence? He also spare not thee. In other words, we'll be broken off too, right? Gentiles. Now look, I'm not talking about you as a member of the body of Christ are going to be broken off. Some people use that verse to teach that you can lose your salvation. That's not what this is. This is about our program. In other words, the program where Gentiles are getting the goodness of God because God is working with them. Are you with me there? And so what he's saying is, this isn't going to go on forever. Didn't we already know that? Sure we did. But he says, you know what? There's something that if you don't continue in the goodness of God, you also will be cut off. And that's going to, and so when he says, and that's in the verse that follows this, 22. So take heed lest he also spare not thee. In other words, now here's my question. If God's just arbitrarily doing it, no matter what we do, why would you need to take heed? And that's my point. You don't, because if it's take heed lest he spare not thee, that tells me that if he breaks this program off, it's going to be on us. Does that make sense to you? Now see, that's what I'm seeing. Is anybody lost right here? I have this fear that I'm making it worse. Okay, Karen?
When I first read that last week, I thought of the rewards we're going to get in the heavenly places. You know, we better take care of it now because we're supposed to be learning. And if we don't learn, then we're devoted, so to speak, in heavenly places.
Okay, that's a true statement. That's a true statement. I think what he's really talking about here, though, in the context is the program. Yeah, and you see that. Okay. Now, here's the next thing I want to do. By the way, there's something else. Mark, you want to ask a question?
We're talking about the care of the guiding of the Lord. Take heed. It's not.
Yeah, well, okay. Well, I'm saying the breaking off is not of individuals, happening one at a time. It'll be the entire opportunity of mercy being offered to the whole world will be broken off. It will be because of something, I believe, that we, as not only saved people, but people who have made the cry of Abba, Father, and are engaged in sonship because of something we are doing. Yeah.
When they crucified Jesus, he said it was the leaders, you know, the nation of Israel during the extra year.
Right.
There were individual people that did believe that were saved during that time, but it was the leaders. You take the leaders as a group, as a whole, you know, although you have individual people in there, and maybe if one individual will listen, other individuals would have, but it was the group called the leaders,
Right.
you know, that actually rejected.
That's right.
But if they would have taken heed back then, they may not have been broken off.
They had the spiritual charge of the nation. And if they had done the right thing, the nation would have followed suit. They would have.
So responsibility, basically sons and daughters.
So now, yes. So you're taking that and making the application. Yes. The responsibility now is not on the Pharisees and the scribes. Now it's on sons and daughters. And we'll talk about, and by the way, this is pointing us very close to the wow factor that I talked to you about, the impact, the depth of impact that this is supposed to make.
You brought up two reasons that would cause it to come to the end. One was grace, the other was our sin.
Right. And I was saying it's both of those, has to be both of those together.
Because grace could still abound even though sonship has failed.
Right. And why? I'm looking for my marker. I'm listening to you. But I'm going to put something on the board here. I can't find it. First I lost the top, then I lost the marker.
Behind the Bible.
Oh, thank you. Okay. This is not going as well as I thought it would. All right. Why is it just the preaching of grace enough? I know. Right. Because if the preaching of grace alone and salvation by grace was enough to keep the dispensation of grace going, does that give God any sons or daughters? No. It has to go beyond that. Now, is there anything in your Bible that ever told you why God saved you? The answer is yes, and it's sitting over in the book of Galatians. He redeemed them that were under the law, that we might receive the adoption of sons. The whole reason God saved us, remember, He justified us and He sanctified us, because without that, we can't be educated as sons and daughters. The whole reason, see, for all those years that I was in church, I thought the end result was just get people saved. And not that there's anything wrong with that. Of course that's right. But I thought that was the end. Then I find out God saved you for a higher purpose than just getting saved. If you just get saved, of what use will you be to labor with Him in the creature? None. You'll just be there.
You know what I'm thinking right now is, Satan's master sonship to most Christians. Very few of the stuff.
That's true.
And I got to thinking, there's a reason why this Christian program is still going. They say we're always welcome to that stuff. That's what we're talking about now.
That's correct.
It might stop. Satan successfully shuts down the sonship program.
I think you're absolutely right. I think you're absolutely right. And the only reason I'm not going to repeat that for the camera is because you're jumping ahead of me. But no, I'll say it because that's a good observation, Clifford. When Satan successfully shuts sonship down in the world, there won't be any reason to continue doing the program. It's just like Norma and I were talking before the study today. Think of it like this. We've got a store, and we're offering a product in our store. Let's say the product is, you know what? Let's go back years, and we're selling cassette tapes. We're selling 8-tracks. How about, does anybody remember that other than me? Am I the only one old enough to remember 8-tracks? All right, you're selling 8-tracks, and that's what we're selling. And they're going like hotcakes for a while. And then you know what happens? It begins to get less and less and less. And finally, guess what? Nobody's coming in to buy 8-tracks anymore. So you know what we're going to do? If they're not going to come in and buy 8-tracks anymore, we got to do one of two things. We either got to close the store, or we got to sell something different. Thank you. Change the program.
Okay, there is a problem that I see right now happening.
Okay?
We're going to give the internet to the world. And other countries do not want our freedom like we have.
Right.
Freedom of speech, freedom of all this. They're going to start shutting it down. The word will not get out.
I wouldn't be surprised at that one bit, Bertha.
I just can't believe that that's happening.
Well, you know what I think they'll do? And I know you would agree with this. They'll shut this down in stages.
Right.
Things that they don't want on there, they'll find a way to shut that stuff off first. It's just a way of being able to get this within reach to control it.
Right.
And then use it for their own purpose. You're absolutely right. Satan is not looking at this and not paying attention. I assure you, he is. We've got a grand opportunity in front of us now to use the internet to promote sonship, but one day that'll come to a halt, and it will. Okay, now, I want to take you over now to these verses. Sorry, I just need to get a cap on this. Okay, I'm going to take you over to these verses that I told you I'd take you to a while ago, and I want to show you because I said this is a time when God is showing mercy, and I did that crabs thing, so let me get out of that. Oh, I'm sorry, I got this first. I forgot to put this on the PowerPoint. When he says, be not high-minded but fear, what is he talking about? And here's the two things that I think that we legitimately ought to fear about this program being broken off. Because look, let me ask you this, and before we do this, let me just ask you this. If you're talking about be not high-minded but fear, take heed lest he also, cut thee off. Let me ask you a question. If the thing ended right now, and we all went up in the rapture right now, tell me what's going to happen to you. Somebody tell me something that's going to happen. Okay, all right, you have no idea. But what else has happened to it? You get a glorified body. What else? What else is true? You will get caught up, right? You won't be here anymore. And because you're not here anymore, what have you left behind? Grace ends, that's true. But I mean for you personally, because you've received grace, right? Sufferings this present time are over. So are the sufferings of Christ, which is the attacks of the policy of evil. They're all over, right? What else is true for you? You'll be with the Lord. What else? By the way, you get a glorified body, you'll be with the Lord, your sufferings are over. Well, you won't have your education, but let's leave that one for last, because I am going to talk about that one. I'm not trying to avoid it. But what else is true for you? We get placed in our positions. By the way, and no matter where you are in that position, is that a good thing? Okay. Look, when he says fear and take heed, he is not talking about what you're supposed to be afraid of because the dispensation of grace ended, because you've already mentioned the worst thing that can be possible for you. And the worst thing is, I'm not yet a fully educated son. That's the worst thing. But let me ask you something. Is not being a man of understanding the kind of thing that your father is looking at you and saying, boy, you better be afraid if you're not a man of understanding?
You're going to be left behind.
See, is that what he's doing with us? Is that really a fear issue? No. I mean, are we afraid because we're getting a glorified body? Are we afraid because we're with the Lord? Are we afraid because there's no more suffering? Are we afraid because we're in the heavenly places? We've been given a position of honor, and we've received not only the heir of God inheritance, but also a portion of that joint heir inheritance. That's not anything to fear. Do you see what I'm saying? For us, I mean, you could almost say what Paul said. I have a desire to depart, which is far better. Right? Yeah. But look, what is it we're going to fear? First of all, fear for others for what takes place once the dispensation of grace ends. What does happen for others? I'm not talking about sons and daughters. Well, let's do this. What happens to Gentiles? Gentiles get reconciled over the adversary, and they're broken out of the tree of God's working with them, right? The tree of His goodness. And so what will happen to Gentiles? What tree do they wind up back in? The wild olive tree. And that means what God are they going to be worshiping over there? Every God but the true God. That's where they're going to be. That is something to fear, isn't it? Now let's do the Jews. When the dispensation of grace ends, what happens to Israel? The day of wrath. See, I look at those things and I think, if He took, because I sat in my office and I thought, if He took me right now, I mean, I want to finish my education, there's no doubt, but if He took me right now, I got to say, going to be with my Father is not something I'm not looking forward to doing. You know, I talked to Milt at the hospital. I've talked to him a couple of times since, and I know this for a fact because Milt said this. He said, you know, I didn't know what was happening to me there. He said, but I wasn't afraid to go. Now, I'm glad he's here because misery loves company. But you know what? I believe Milt told the truth about that. He wasn't afraid to go. I mean, we're not jumping in front of bullets, but you know what? If we go, it's going to be a glorious time, yes? It's going to be sad for everybody left behind, but pretty soon they'll get up there. And then it'll just be, you know, it's going to be... Okay, here's the second thing. The fear on the behalf of ourselves for failing in our responsibility to our Father. And the reason I'm saying that is because of verse 22. Let me see if I can take you back over there. Well, before I read this, let me just explain that. In fact, I'll just back it up to that. Because if thou continue in His goodness, otherwise thou also shalt be cut off. What I take it to mean, to continue in His goodness, is to continue to participate and cooperate with what God is accomplishing by putting us into His goodness in the first place. In other words, is God just being good to us Gentiles just so He can be good to us? Or does He have a reason, a purpose behind His goodness? And what is that purpose? Because you have to remember that by the time you get to from Romans 8:14 and 15, he has been talking to sons who have made the cry of Abba, Father. And you know what? And I take this that he's talking to us, sons and daughters. You've got to continue in that goodness. By the way, I had some verses here, and I'm going to skip. I'll come back to these. But look at this. According to my earnest expectation and my hope that in nothing I shall be ashamed, but that with all boldness, as always, so now also Christ shall be magnified in my body, whether it be by life or by death. For me to live is Christ, but to die is gain. But if I live in the flesh, this is the fruit of my labor. Yet what I shall choose I wot not. For I am in a strait betwixt two, having a desire to depart and to be with Christ, which is far better. Do you see? Was Paul afraid of that? No. And so he says, nevertheless, to abide in the flesh is more needful for you. Why was it more needful? Because what was Paul's ministry? He was writing to the Philippians. Do you know what he was doing? He was giving them part of the sonship education. He was saying, for me to stick around and be here is more needful for you. Now, by the way, this raises a point, and I want to bring it up. If you're saying, be not high-minded but fear, and this is the way this gets taught, I'm just telling you, it's easy, you can go look it up. The reason that you're supposed to fear is because God could cut this off at any moment. He's not looking for anything on our part or anybody else's part. He's just one day going to just say, I'm just going to cut it off, I'm going to cut it off. So you need to fear that He's going to cut it off. But if that were true, then you should also find a verse in there where Paul tells you to fear dying. Because if He cuts it off right here, we don't finish our education. And guess what? If you die today, you don't finish your education. Did you ever find Paul telling you to fear death? We just got through reading a whole passage where he talks about the direct opposite of that. Because wouldn't dying have the same effect as ending the dispensation of grace for you? Yes! See, again, this doesn't make sense to me. So I look at this and I'm thinking, all right, so that's what let me back up now. Well, let me give you the next verse. I was starting not to do it. And having this confidence, I know that I shall abide and continue with you all for your furtherance and joy of faith. Funny he uses that word, isn't it? I'm going to continue with you. You know what he just wrote back there, what Paul writes back there in Romans chapter 11? If thou continue in His goodness. By continuing in His goodness, I don't think he's just saying, as long as you continue to get the goodness of God, and when you don't, then you'll be broke off. I think he's saying, because the word heed is in there. Heed is paying attention to the consequences of your actions and trying to avoid those consequences. Because if God's just going to do it any old time, you don't need to take heed. By the way, I got to tell you that I'm not sure how that motivates me. Let's suppose that you're in college and you're taking the test that's going to determine if you're going to pass the course or not. And the professor hands out this 15-page test and he says, okay, and you say, how long have we got, Professor? And he goes, I'm just going to cut it off when I cut it off. It may be in 1 minute, it might be in 10 minutes, it might be in 2 hours, or it might be in 4 hours. You have no idea. Now, part of you will say, well, I better get with it. But the other part of you is saying, if he cuts this off in 1 minute, what's the natural thought that follows that? What's the use? If he's just going to cut this off and I'm not going to get a chance, what is the use? Some people are just going to lay their pencils down and go, fine. But if the professor says this, as long as you're continuing to work on this test, I'll give you all the time you need. And you know what that sounds like to me? Grace. That sounds like grace. It's. Do you see? You see the Christmas sales, and you go to Walmart or Kmart, and they've got this thing that's the hot item, and they've only got so many, and they're going to be on sale for this unbelievably low price, and people line up outside the door waiting. Have you ever stood in those lines, Kim? You ever stood in those lines? And you know, and you're going to get in there. But here's what you know before you ever get in the door. Huh? It's limited supply. I don't think grace is like Walmart's special on Christmas sale. I think grace is enough. As long as we're getting it, we're given an opportunity to get it. And that makes sense with grace to me. By the way, let's do a little exercise and see if we can prove this. What have I got left here? How many people did Jesus die for when He died on the cross? All right. So if He died for all, then how many people did God want to be saved? Okay. So God wants all saved. And for everybody that's saved, how many of those does He want to become sons and daughters? By the way, whether they know it or not, when they received Jesus Christ as their Savior in this dispensation of grace, they were made a son, were they not? Whether they ever do a thing with it. So it indicates to me, if that's part of the salvation package, how many people has God given that opportunity to? Everybody. Everybody. Well, you do. Well, you don't have to ask to be a son, but you got to make the cry of Abba Father, say, I'm accepting the invitation. Yeah. What's that? We're going to talk about that. Thank you for bringing that up. That Clifford is ahead of me. I don't know what's going on with this. He's okay. He's yeah, because it ain't you, buddy. Okay, no. Huh? Yeah. That we might receive the adoption of sons. That's why we got saved. That's right. So if He wants everybody, to become sons and daughters, then does it not actually work against the program to say, right in the middle of sons and daughters coming on board and getting educated, let's stop it? Because if you stop it, you just did something that runs counter to what you have made clear you want to do. Right? Is that making sense to y'all? I mean, it's up to you whether you agree with it or not. I just want to know if it makes sense, what I'm saying here. That if He's saying, I want, if this is us, if this is all there is, and He says, I want all of you to become sons and daughters, and how far does He want us to go in the education? He wants us to go all the way if that's what we'll do. I mean, He's not going to make us do it, but if that's what we'll do, that's what He wants. Well, does it make sense, if that's what you want, to take sons and daughters that are in the midst of that and cut it off and go, time's up?
But He makes a promise. I'll stick with you as long as you continue your sonship. You're given the will to walk away.
See, that's what I see. And when sonship, when nobody's coming in the store of God's goodness anymore and participating in what He's accomplishing in this dispensation of grace, then He's perfectly, right and just to close the doors. But if we continue in that goodness, now what's the impact of that statement? The continuance. If I'm right, obviously I think I am, maybe I'm not. But if I'm right, the dispensation of grace remaining open is on our shoulders. Now, wait a minute. You may look at that and say, oh, I don't know if that's right. I have a question for you. When you get into the heavenly places, in fact, I just need to find this in the notes because I need to do this right. I'm going to just read this to you. It's right out of your notes, but I want you to listen to this and tell me if this makes sense to you. Because if you say that, where did I go? That fear, if the dispensation of grace is really on your shoulders, is that not an issue then to fear about? Not fear like I'm afraid of my Father or I'm afraid I've lost my salvation. But there are people dependent on you that don't even know they're depending on you. And because you know it, you have this fearful responsibility. Yes?
It also lines up with what we already learned about why this education is so important and our commitment to it.
Exactly. Mark is saying this lines up with what we've already learned about why this education is important and why we're involved in it. Now, I don't know where in the notes, it's after that Philippians 1:25 verse, and it says the second fear, it's there in your notes. But I want to read this to you because I really want us to see this. What comes to my mind is this. Page 7? Okay. Now, if you want to follow, you can, or you can just listen. But I took a lot of time to structure this right, so I don't want to say it and leave something out. So I'm just going to read it to you. What comes to my mind is this. We already know that our Father is going to put His business into our hands in eternity. Yes? Yes. We'll be given real responsibilities in the creature, and they're not small or insignificant to what He wants accomplished. Do you believe that? The question I'm really getting to here is, are these responsibilities real, or He's just giving us the illusion of laboring with Him? Well, they're real. All right, let's finish that paragraph. It really does matter, then, if we can perform them or not, doesn't it? It really does matter. All right, next paragraph. We will be given positions of such a nature, and God is the one that set it up this way, that what God desires to see accomplished will depend upon us doing our jobs. What we will do in the creature will not be just for show without any real substance to it. God has not made it so that if we fumble the ball, it won't make any difference because He'll come along and fix it Himself, as though our part in His plan and purpose doesn't really impact the success of what He wants to do. Do you see what I'm getting at here? That we are an integral part of this from the beginning. Well, if I'm correct about what Paul is saying in verses 20 to 22, then what we're doing right now is sonship practice for what comes later. If we're thinking about this properly, then we realize that if God breaks off His program with Gentiles, it will be because we didn't do our job. And what is that job? That job that's called continue in His goodness. What is that job? Being sons and daughters in this education. And by the way, you can be in the education and just go through the motions and not really the commitment to it, like we discussed back in orientation, that threefold commitment of honest attendance and interactive learning and top priority. If you're just going through the motions, is that enough? No. If it's not really working in us, it's not enough. He can look at that and count that as though nothing is going on. So what we're looking at here is, if He's going to put it in our hands up there, is it really that big of a stretch to say that we're going to do some apprenticeship type training, that He has put something in our hands down here? And this, what we're doing here, you don't have to be a fully educated son to do. All you have to do is stay in the education as a son. And what we're going to find out is, I'm not saying we're the dispensers of grace. I'm not saying we have the power to do things that only God does. God will be the one to break that program off. He'll be the one to do that. But the time that He could really do that and not violate what He's trying to do by grace or in an attempt to get sons and daughters, is to wait until this thing, what Clifford said a while ago, when the policy of evil is successful at shutting sonship down, then the father can look and say, you know what, there's not anybody coming into the store anymore. I might as well close the doors or change the product. And now we're going to do the Israel product. And he'll get that going. Does that make sense to you? Now, I think there's more I want to say here. The way I understand the passage forces the body of Christ to take responsibility for what God is seeking to accomplish here during the dispensation of grace. No, we're not the authors of grace, but we are, now I wrote this, but we are partners with God in this thing, are we not? And then in the next phrase I thought, oh no, it's better than that. Better yet, we are sons with Him in what He's doing in this dispensation of grace. Isn't that better than being a partner? What I'm getting at is God is not going maverick on us and we're just along for the ride. In other words, it doesn't matter what we're doing. He just got His own thing going and we're just totally out of it. That's not what sonship is about. Now I love this. Just as He depended on His Son to do His part in Israel's program, He is depending on sons to do their part in the mystery program. That is, this is on us, isn't it? Or has He just cut us out of the process altogether? When you learn those sonship skills, aren't you supposed to hone and sharpen those skills by putting them into practice in your everyday life? Isn't that part of the apprenticeship training? It is. Well, I can see training practice for us right now. If we continue in that which His goodness provides to us in this dispensation of grace, which is the sonship life, then God will continue to extend that goodness. It's a privilege, but a fearful privilege to know that God is putting the ball in our hands, so to speak, and trusting us to continue what He began with the Apostle Paul. Yes? How much did He put that in Paul's hands? When they stoned him at Lystra, what did God do? Send him back! That goodness started with Paul, and now we are in God's goodness, and will be in His goodness if we continue in that goodness. And if we don't, otherwise, thou also shalt be cut off. You know what the Scripture says? Now, maybe I'm all wet. Maybe I got this wrong. And I got to thinking about it. What have I done to you if I got this wrong? And God is kind of operating all on His own. And He's not looking at what's going on down here. He's just kind of deciding. Well, you will have thought that your responsibility was more than it was. You didn't have a responsibility to carry this on. But doesn't that kind of run counter to why we're being trained as sons anyway?
I was going to say, why would He even give you the education?
See this whole thing. Okay, go ahead.
We come under this Calvinistic viewpoint again.
He's the one running it and directing it.
Just do
Haven't we come to that place when He talks about those wise counsels, when He sits down with men of understanding and He says, all right, what are we going to do from here? And He's going to put that in our hands. See, this is not a stretch to me. And you say, okay, so what's the big difference then, Mike? What's the big difference? If you're right, what's the big difference? Then suddenly it's not be afraid because the dispensation of grace is coming to an end, because I'm not afraid of that. The fear will be, it came to an end on my watch. That I would be part of the problem. When I think about look, okay, and I just want to do this last thing here because the deal's gone off. Just think like your Father for a moment. And you're up there in the third heaven. You've interrupted this program with Israel 2,000 years ago, and you're in the midst of this dispensation of grace, and the whole purpose of this thing is to raise up sons and daughters that you have put your wisdom in them so that they think like you, live like you, and they're qualified to labor with you in what you're doing. And they're in the midst of this program, and now that message is beginning to go somewhere that did not go before. It wasn't in Monahans before, and it is now. And I can name dozens of places around the world where it is now that it wasn't before. And we still get calls every week from people saying, I'm following this thing online, please tell me where's the nearest church that teaches this. Do you know how hard it is to come up with that? Because they're just not. But if you see this starting to go somewhere now and to do something, if you're the father, how do you feel about looking at what's going on? How do you feel about that? You've got to be excited about that because the thing you're trying to do in this dispensation of grace is happening. Right? But if you don't have any external reason for doing what you're doing, do you think for a moment the Father is looking at this and saying, nah, let's just cut this off?
No, because he's preparing us. He said Satan has to play by the rules.
That's right. He has to play by the rules and say, here's what I'm saying. The Father has a zeal for His program with Israel, but His zeal is just as great for what He's accomplishing in the dispensation of grace. And here's what I know about my Father. He is patient. 2,000 years of a dispensation of grace, to the Jewish mind, way too long. You need to get back to us. But to our Heavenly Father, if what He wants to see done is being done, oh, I got to say this one, I promise I'll say this and we'll quit. If your kids are doing, if you look at your children and you see them maturing and growing into adults that you look at with I'm talking about in the right way, with a pride that swells your heart to say, those are my kids. Do you want to stop that? Do you know what you're wanting to say? As long as it's going like that, let's let that happen. Do you see? Now that's what I'm looking at. We have one other issue to discuss with this, and that's that little issue called the fullness of the Gentiles be come in. And in that we're going to talk about what is God looking for then. And I know we've already said this, but you might say, what about, like Clifford brought up, what about a number of seats in the heavenly places? What about a time? We'll discuss that when we come back from the break.